What's up, Truthers? It's Ben here, and I wanted to come to you today and talk about something that somebody brought up to me the other day. Kind of a change of scenery here. I'm in my shed, actually working on staying in a picture frame and working on staying in a crib. So I'm going to work on that as I talk. Sometimes I do my best thinking and ramblings as I'm doing something else. But what happened was somebody asked me the other day about Roman Catholicism. Now, what had happened was this person had been speaking to a person who's a Roman Catholic, and the Roman Catholic, from what I can tell, and what you can gather, they kind of were talking about the canon. They were talking about the differences between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, and Christianity and Roman Catholicism, because I would say that there is a difference between those two. Roman Catholicism doesn't hold to the tenets that I would say that you need to hold to in order to be considered a Christian, at least biblically. But that's, of course, the ever flowing debate. And so, what happened was they were talking, and this person brought up some Bible verses, and they were quoting some Bible verses. The Roman Catholic person was quoting some Bible verses to the Protestant, and this Protestant person had never heard these verses before, and the things that they were quoting just seemed kind of weird, and they were just kind of curious, and they didn't understand what was going on. Well, it turns out that the person was quoting from the Apocrypha. Now, if you didn't know, the Roman Catholic Bible and the Christian or Protestant Bible is different. The Roman Catholic Bible in the Old Testament, they have several more books included in their Old Testament that are called the Apocrypha. They have 1st and 2nd Maccabees and several other ones that we Protestants wouldn't hold to. So it kind of threw her for, a loop, and she hadn't really thought or heard of this before, and this person was just kind of taken aback. So they called me and asked me about it. And so it got me thinking, this is such a vital area of importance for Christians. Because what happens in Christianity most times, especially in, maybe charismatic church or churches that are just seeker sensitive, or if it's just a very surface level church where you're just there to get your feelings acknowledged, you're there to hang out with your friends. They have a good children's ministry, there's things like that. There's a youth group and a choir, and there's things for, you can get involved. And if that's the reason you're going to church, and if that's your only church experience, then you're going to be very shocked when you start running into people of different religions, like this person. So what happened was, obviously, they, just from that one little conversation that they had, they were wondering, well, what is the difference between our Bibles? And then all of a sudden that goes from what's the difference between our Bibles to why do we have two different Bibles? Well, and why do we have two Bibles goes to, well, who Bible is right? Well, then that goes to, how did we get the Bible? And that's where the conversation kind of ended. And obviously it'll pick back up later. But I wanted to talk about this because this is such an area of overlooked, just necessary knowledge, in my opinion. Because what happens is that people kind of think Christianity it's almost like a social club. If all you do is interact with other Christians or other Protestants, or if you're part of the ecumenical movement, obviously that a lot of people started back in the early 2000s. There's this kind of there's no difference between us and Rome, and we should all just be one big happy family, and we're trying to embrace our Roman brothers and sisters and all that. If you're that kind of mindset, then this kind of stuff doesn't bother you because it's irrelevant, because you probably aren't going to run into this issue in life. Because if you're not actually actively going out trying to reach people who are lost or who don't believe what you believe, then you're not going to encounter questions like this. So I just want to take a moment to talk about how we actually got the canon. Now, the canon is just a word for measurement. It doesn't have to be strictly adhered to the Bible, or to Christianity. It just means measurement or a record of things. So when we talk about the Christian canon, we're talking about the Bible, or the letters that got accepted into the Bible. Because the Bible obviously didn't come down to us in the form that we have today, leather back with the gold edging on the outside and the thumb indexing. It's got the letters so you could flip to the books, especially the ones in the Old Testament that are hard to find. Obadiah, Hosea, Amos, the ones that nobody ever reads. And so a lot of people think that's what our Bible always has been. And so if that's what you think, then arguments by online atheists or Bart Ehrmans or people, when they start saying things like, well, the Bible didn't really actually come into existence until the Council of Nicaea, when Constantine and a bunch of other early church fathers just voted on it. So what they did was they lined up a book of the Bible. They'd take Matthew. They'd go, all right, this is Matthew, and they set Matthew up on the table. Said, all in favor, aye, aye, and then all opposed, oppose, aye, and then they'd go, okay. And then they just went through, and there was, people say, there were 70, 80 different gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Mary. That was kind of a big one a couple years ago, right? The Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And turns out that was a fraud, by the way, fun fact, but whatever. History Channel picked it up because, any chance they get to actually attack the real Bible. But I'm getting on a rant here. But that's not what happened. So what happened was the letter is written. So let's say that Paul writes his letter to the Colossians. Now, obviously, he's talking to the church in Colossae. He's saying some things to them, some specific things, but he's saying things that he knows are going to be circulated to the church abroad. Because at the end of the letter to the Colossians, obviously, he says, hey, read this to the church in Laodicea. And he says, in the letter that I wrote to them, make sure that you read that one. So Paul is obviously under the understanding that his letters are going to be read by multiple people in multiple places in different settings. So he writes things specifically to that church, but he also writes general truths and specific truths, especially in Colossians, Colossians 1:18, in chapter 2, the fullness of God dwelled bodily in Christ. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I remember, I think it was Derek Prince, who was an old charismatic Pentecostal preacher, who I mean, we had differences, but he was very solid. And he said, I think the letter to the Colossians should be called the letter against heresy, because there's so much in there that can be used against the cults, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, things like that. But so what happens is Paul writes that, and he sends it out, and he goes, this is good. And the church in Colossae gets the letter. And they go, oh man, this is awesome. This is great. And obviously we're supposed to send it to Laodicea. And they find a bunch of truths in there, and then they go, well, we should probably copy that. And so they do copy it. And then they send the original, or a copy of the original, out to the church, and then it starts circulating. And then what happens is, obviously, the church finds that these letters are very important to them. Obviously, that they contain a lot of truth about Christ and what he's preached, and obviously the apostles who are still living at the time, right? You still got the 12 apostles minus Judas, who's replaced. You have Paul. You have the other apostles who were with Jesus, not the 12, but the 70. So you have people that are there to confirm the truths that are there. So it's not just, and then Paul, obviously in Acts chapter 15 of the Jerusalem Council, meets with Peter and John. So there's all these letters going around. There's people there to confirm that they are real. Obviously, all these men are dead by the end of the first century. So by the year 100, all the men are dead. Obviously, John has died. He wrote the book of Revelation last, circa probably 70, something like that, or earlier. And so they all die. So in my understanding, and I would argue that the canon of Scripture is done and written and mostly accepted by the end of the first century. Now, it doesn't come, obviously, leather bound and, held together at the brim, with all 27 of New and 39 letters or books of the Old Testament. But it's generally accepted, and the Old Testament canon was pretty much accepted. Obviously, if you read about the books being laid up in the temple, if you've heard somebody use that phrase. And if you ever notice, Jesus, when he's in the New Testament, in the Gospels, he's speaking with a Pharisee, they never have an argument about whether or not a book of the Old Testament is authoritative. And I heard that, I think, from James White, and I remember thinking, that's very interesting. I had never noticed that. So it seems that the Old Testament canon, obviously, had already been established by the time Jesus was there. You had the intertestamental period. But by the time Jesus gets there, it's pretty much accepted. And so by the end of the first century, all the authors who have written letters are dead. So it would seem that all the people who have authority, the apostles, obviously people like Luke, who are apostles of the apostles or disciples of the apostles. And then you have, obviously, Mark, which is an account of, written by Mark, recounting Peter and his experience with Jesus. So it's kind of like, it's Mark's gospel, but it's kind of Peter's gospel as well. So they write those, and those get distributed and sent out. So for the most part, I would argue that the canon is mostly closed by the end of the first century. So obviously the last book to be accepted in the canon was the book of Revelation. And I'm kind of glad that it had to fight for inclusion. Now, when you say inclusion, there's always this idea that there had to be some kind of, official church council that said this is what's in and this is what's not. But that's not what happened. What happened was that the canon was assembled, slowly over time by the church, by them, figuring out and understanding and coming to the agreement that these books are authoritative and they teach proofs that are obviously true, and we can double check them with the apostles and the people that are alive now. So once they die out, obviously letters written after that, obviously, you get second century Gnostic works like the Gospel of Thomas, because they're trying to get these things included in the church by putting a name on it so it seems authoritative. Obviously, by that point, most of the early church fathers and the early church have already come to understand which ones are and which ones aren't. Now, obviously, there's no official, I can't remember when the first official canon appears. You have Jerome, and then you have Marcion, who has his heretical canon, or his, heretical list of books. But it's pretty much already understood by the end of the first century what was written by the apostles and what wasn't. And the reason that there's no official 100% clear, concise, councils and putting things together is because Christianity is illegal for the first 300 years. So for 300 years, it's not like they can get together. There's no printing presses. They can't get together and have things, done legally in many parts because they're on the run. Many of them are just trying to live and survive. So what's ended up happening is we end up getting copies, right? Papyrus copies, vellum copies. You get things like that. Later on, handwritten copies. And in those handwritten copies, obviously, as time goes on, there are subtle differences in them. You might have what they call a textual variant, which just means a difference between one manuscript and another. A good example would be in the book of Ephesians. Paul writes, and it says, "To the saints who are in Ephesus." Well, there's a textual variant there. In some of the oldest and some of the most reliable manuscripts, it says, "To the saints who are in Ephesus," and then some of the manuscripts just say, "To the saints who are." So we don't know if it was specifically directed at Ephesus. I think most people would agree that it probably was, but we can't know for certain. So is that a textual variant? Yes, it is. Does it make a difference in the letter? Yes, it does. Does it affect Christian doctrine in any way, shape, or form? No. Does it affect the deity of Christ? Does it affect our understanding of the Trinity? Does it affect our understanding of worship? No, none of these things do. So none of these textual variants or differences between the manuscripts that show up have any impact on our actual Christianity proper, or our orthodox understanding of Christianity. So none of those variants actually hold any real weight. Some people would argue they do, but it's a very small number, somewhere around 1,500 meaningful variants. So that's like one meaningful variant possibly per every 3 pages. I think it's what it's worked out to be. But anyways, that's kind of getting on a tangent. So what we need to understand is that you need to understand how we got the Bible. You need to spend time watching people like James White, people like Dan Wallace, people like Michael Kruger. You need to spend some time reading what they've written. You need to at least have read, somebody like Josh McDowell and his New Evidence That Demands a Verdict, things like that. You need to read books like that, and you need to spend time understanding, because what's going to happen is that if you have no background in the textual transmission of the Bible, specifically the New Testament, obviously, we would probably find that that's where most of the attacks come against it. If you don't have any understanding of that, you've never spent time on it, then you're going to run into situations like this, where you're going to be speaking or dialoguing with a Roman Catholic, and they're going to say something, and their Bible is going to be different, or their understanding of the Bible is going to be different, or they're going to have, a book that you don't have, and if you don't understand how you got your Bible in the first place, then you're going to be left at a loss, because if they have any understanding, at least of how they understand that they have their Bible, they're going to have an advantage against you. Now, obviously, I would argue that it's not really an advantage, because they didn't have an official canon list until the Council of Trent in the 16th century. But if they know that and you don't know anything, then you're going to be in a world of hurt, and you're going to be left standing with your feet firmly planted in midair, to quote Ravi Zacharias. So spend some time watching some people. Watch James White. He is by far, I think, one of the best teachers, one of the best oral speakers, and he does a very good job of presenting, the New Testament reliability things. He's done debates with people about whether the New Testament is reliable. And I know when you watch it, if you haven't seen any of it before, if you haven't engaged in this conversation with people, then you're going to be lost at first. But don't be discouraged. Don't give up just because it's hard. It's something you need to understand. And at one point, I had no idea about any of this. I mean, I was raised in Georgia, in the South. It's hot out here, drinking some water. I was raised in Georgia in the South, kind of grew up in the church, quote unquote, in the church, most of my life. Went to youth group at several churches. I went to a Baptist church. I went to an Alliance church, hung out with my friends, and, we would get there, and, what you get is a lot of music, a lot of emotion, a lot of playing in the gym, dodgeball, kickball, basketball, hanging out with friends. And you'd get together, and you'd go sing some songs for about, 15, 20 minutes. And they'd go, good, that's awesome. You'd sit down, and then the youth pastor or your pastor would get up there, give about a 15, 20-minute presentation on how awesome you are and how loved you are and how Jesus is amazing and all these things, which are true. And then that's it. You never actually spend any time, even if you go to Sunday school, you're not going to spend any time studying this. Most people have never encountered this information, and I was one of those people. It wasn't until I actually got saved in my late 20s after I was out of the Marine Corps that I discovered Ravi Zacharias. I started looking at apologetics, and I discovered Josh McDowell, and I went from Josh McDowell to James White, and now I follow, the Reformed movement, and I follow reformers, and I look back at history, and I have a much larger grasp of history than I did before. Secular and non-secular history. It's important to understand all of it. And so when somebody comes to me with a question like this, they say, I don't understand what's the difference? I don't understand. I've never encountered this. I can say, pretty firmly that, yes, I've encountered it. I've looked at it. I've watched debates. I've spent time, looking at the material, and it doesn't shake me. In the book of Ephesians, it says, we're not supposed to be blown to and fro by every wind of doctrine. And unfortunately, that's what happens with people because they are blown to and fro by every wind of incorrect history. And I think that that's probably not as important as the Bible, but it's pretty close behind it, because if you don't understand how we got the Bible, if you don't understand why it's important to understand that you can trust what we have in our Bibles versus somebody else's Bible, then you're not really going to be able to trust what's in the Bible, because you don't know if that Bible that you have is the right Bible. Anyways, I know I kind of rambled on there. I hope this helps. I know I said a lot, but I would suggest for you to do, after you get done watching this video, first like the video, then subscribe to my channel, and then go tell a bunch of your friends about my channel. And tell them to come like my videos too. And then when you get done doing that, go over to my main channel, Primal Truths, and watch those videos. I actually have a new video coming out. I'm working on it right now. I shot it. I'm just editing it. It's different than this. It's probably going to be about a 40 or 50 minutes. It's going to be a Christian critique. But after you get done doing all that and supporting me and liking all my stuff, go over into YouTube and just look up James White and, type in James White New Testament reliability, or James White how we got the New Testament. Look up Michael Kruger. Look up Josh McDowell. Look up, any of those people would be good sources. Dan Wallace. Dan Wallace is probably one of the premier believing New Testament scholars. That's important. There are New Testament scholars who are not believing Christians who don't believe it. Obviously, Bart Ehrman would be the prime example of that. But Dan Wallace is a believing Christian, and he does probably some of the most amazing introductory lectures that we have on the New Testament and how we got the Bible and how we can trust it. Now, he's the president of CSNTM, which is the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. Great website. They go all around the world photographing and digitizing New Testament manuscripts, and they put them online, and they're free. You can go look at them anytime you want. You can look at, the oldest ones we have, P52, the John Rylands Papyri, which is, circa 90 to 125 AD. We don't have an exact date on that. They usually give plus or minus 25 years on those. And he'll talk about that and how early it is, and then they'll talk about how early that is compared to other things like works of Aristotle or Plato. We have Homer's Iliad, which is probably the closest work in antiquity in terms of the amount of handwritten copies or manuscripts we have, but it's not anywhere close to the New Testament, not even close. And watching these men, even though it's going to be hard at first, you're going to be confused, you're not going to understand terms, you're going to be exposed to things that make you feel uncomfortable. If you're a King James onlyist and you've used King James your entire life, you're going to be uncomfortable. If you use the NIV or the ESV and you don't understand why you use that Bible and it's just something that you've used because your parents bought it for you, you're going to be uncomfortable. If you hear words like textual variants and papyri and minuscule and uncial and majuscule, it's going to make you uncomfortable. But that's okay. These are things that you need to know. We don't live in an age and a time anymore where you get to just be ignorant and be a Christian. Those days are gone. 100 years ago, 200 years ago, your grandparents, they didn't have to deal with stuff like this probably. They didn't have to defend the transmission of the text of the New Testament, the reliability of the text of the New Testament, and talk about whether or not Constantine created the Bible and, created Christianity, the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD. Those are not things you're going to have to deal with. But we do. And in an ever-increasing secular culture that is more worried about pushing the agenda of the color of your skin than they are understanding biblical truths that will actually save the eternal resting place of your soul, we need to be ahead of those things. And we're far behind, unfortunately. But take some time, look at them. Start with Dan Wallace, start with James White. Watch a couple of videos. If you have any questions, send me a message. Comment down below. Let me know what you thought. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, anything you don't understand. If there's a video you would like me to make, throw it in the comments. Let me know, and I'll try to make a video on it. If it's something I can do a vlog on, I can do it quickly. If it's not, I'll put it on my main channel, and I'll spend some more time doing it. But this is important. All right, let's spend some time digging into this, as the body of Christ, and get a solid understanding, because this is just a start. If you don't understand this, then you can't understand or debate or dialogue anything else. You can't dialogue with Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, atheists. You need to understand your roots, and you need to set your foundation first, and then everything else will follow. All right, thanks for stopping by, guys. I hope this has been helpful. I know it's been a lot of talking, a lot of rambling, a lot of all over the place, but I think you get my point. We need to know what we believe, and we need to know why we believe it. All right, guys. See you later.